This is not an Etch-a-Sketch. This is my worst nightmare, is that this thing freezes up with all my notes on it. There we go. Whew, that was close. Yeah, we're good. Thanks. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ron, and I'm the pastor here at Vital Point Church. I want to welcome those of you on Facebook Live as well. We are so thrilled that you're joining with us. Welcome to Exeter. It's awesome to be gathered in that space as well. You know, one of the things that I love about our church is that we are a church that desires to point people to Jesus. We are convinced that Jesus is the one who fulfills our connection with God, and he is the one that gives us life and life to the full. And so I love that about our church, is that we are, no matter where we find ourselves, whether we're spiritual, whether we're skeptical, whether we're, a seeker, exploring, growing, we are together learning what it means to connect with God through Jesus and the work of his Holy Spirit in his life. And so we love that about our church, and we love pointing people to Jesus. We also hope that the church will feel like home for you. And one of the things that I see happening in the life of many, many people, whether it's in London or whether it's in Exeter or whether it's even online as well, which we're seeing a bit of the online presence, is there's a growing community sense of home. And I love that about our church. And I hope that over time it'll feel like home for you, and that you'll get to a place where you look at your friends and you say, hey, you should come to my church. And and if they say, hey, I've already got my church, then you say, great, go to your church. And if they say, hey, I don't go to church, not into church, you should say, hey, you should come to my church. And invite as many people as possible. And instead of talking about the Netflix shows that you're into, talk about church every once in a while. I think it's a pretty awesome opportunity to do that. I've often said that if I wasn't the pastor of Vital Point, I'd probably go here. And so I think this would be a good opportunity for you to invite some people. So Monday morning, I sat down to write this talk. Monday is my study day, my writing day. Normally on a Monday, my goal is to have some resemblance of a message put together by the end of Monday, maybe Tuesday morning, and then I put it aside and bring it back out on Thursday and work on it. As I was sitting at my office in my study this past Monday, I began reflecting on this idea of the resilient life, because today we're wrapping up the series. 5 weeks ago, we launched the Resilient Life series on a beautiful illustration about our London trailer being stolen. Anyone remember that moment? I sure do. If you don't, and if you aren't aware of it, yes, our London trailer was stolen just over 5 weeks ago. A lot has happened in that 5 weeks when you think about it. I mean, we've got our trailer back, which was awesome. We got some of our gear back, which is even more incredible. Not all of our gear got back, but all the expensive stuff is gone. Imagine that. But we've been replacing it slowly and everything. I was reflecting on the series in the sense of we've been talking about so many different dynamics of the resilient life. We talked about the God of the big picture. We talked about finishing well. We've talked about preparing for emergencies when they arrive in our lives. And we've even talked about unshackling ourselves from our past through the lens of forgiveness. And it was, as I was sitting in my office, I was reflecting on all these things. And I was also reflecting on a number of other areas as well. One was personally in my own life, because I've been journeying with my oldest son and his wife. They just had their first baby just over a week ago. And we actually have a picture, I think. Do we have a picture? I hope we do. Do we have a picture? Oh, is that her? Yeah, that's her. Tatum Esther Baker. I promised I would show as many pictures as possible. This is her. You know, it's interesting as I think personally, you can take that out of there. It was interesting because it didn't go as planned, and she was a bit early and this whole scenario, but yet everyone's good, everything's fine. And so I'm reflecting on that from a personal perspective and some of the joys that come with being a grandfather at so young. And right, I got to go there. But I find it so interesting because on the reflection of the resilient life and a personal perspective, then I jumped into the pastoral role. I've been a pastor for 26 years now, and I was reflecting on that on Monday morning, because a few short hours prior to sitting down in my office writing, I was sitting in the hospital in Exeter with a young couple who had just lost their 8-week-old. And you can imagine the tension that I'm feeling as I sit in my office and reflecting upon just a few short hours prior to that, I was sitting with this family, navigating something that a young couple should never have to face, losing their 8-week-old. I was with them for a few hours, and our site leader, David, in Exeter, he was with them originally, then we sent him home, and I was sitting with this young couple, this young family, in this little room in Exeter Hospital, and we were, after they'd gone through all these procedures and stuff, we were just the three of us, and we were holding hands, the three of us. And from a pastor's perspective, what do you say in those moments? You don't really say much other than just to be there. And to be in that moment. And we prayed together, and I was this young couple, they're early, mid-20s, and I was holding their hands, and we started praying together, and I could sense and feel in the moment as deep sorrow and grief was in that space, I could also sense the presence of God. There was a sense of the presence of God in this moment that was almost tangible to me. It was this, I don't want to over-spiritualize it. I don't want to be all kind of weird about it, but I could just sense in this moment that God was invading this space. See, when we begin to look at the resilient life of faith, we begin to realize that in the midst of our pain, in the midst of our sorrow, in the midst of our interruptions and our setbacks, that there is the possibility of God's presence showing up in the midst of these moments. It's possible. I know for some of us, though, when we look at these moments in our lives, and me included at times, we actually don't look at it this way. We actually look at it from a different perspective. We start shaking our fists and saying, why, God? Why this interruption? Why this grief? Why this loss? Why? And we kind of, and there's a space for that, I believe, and I think God is big enough to take our fist shaking and our anger. But there's something very unique about someone who's growing in their resilient faith, is that they begin to see these moments just a little bit different. That they see them as the possibility of the presence of God showing up. See, the conversation we're going to have this morning as we wrap up this series is going to be this very thing. Is we're going to talk about what does it look like for us to change our perspective on our pain, on our setbacks, on our interruptions. We're only a few weeks into 2020, and we could have a parade of people, believe it or not, from our church alone in London and in Exeter, and some people online that are experiencing these moments. I find it so fascinating that we started 2020 this way, because this series was planned months and months and months ago. But for whatever reason, in God's plan and God's design, the nudge was to do a series like this. And so my hope is that over the next few minutes, as we step into this conversation, that we will find ourselves gaining transformational truth. I do not want to preach reminder this morning. I want to preach transformation this morning. That I hope and pray that each and every one of us, that our minds and our eyes will be open no matter where we find ourselves in the spiritual continuum. You could be brand new to church or back to church for the first time in a long time, or you can be a lifelong follower of Jesus. My hope and my prayer is this morning, as I've been walking in around all this building for this morning, I've been praying, please, Holy Spirit, show up in a powerful way to transform our understanding of our pain. See, oftentimes, it's in our moments of weakness that we get to experience the presence of God the most. There's this writer in the Bible, in the New Testament, named Paul. We often refer to him because he wrote a good chunk of what we call the New Testament. If you've been around church for a long time, you know him as the Apostle Paul. If you're not familiar with him, you need to know that Paul was a strategic part in the advancement of the church among the non-Jewish community, which was the Gentiles. We are here as a result of this guy's leadership. And what's so fascinating about the Apostle Paul is that he spoke many, many times about endurance. He talked many times about resilience and perseverance in the midst of trials and pains and difficulties. And he didn't do it from a theory point of view. He didn't do it from inexperience. He did it from experience. He spoke into these things from his own personal life. You can look at 2 Corinthians chapter 11 if you want to find his resume of the trials and tribulations that he faced and difficulties. It's a long list. He was whipped 39 lashes 5 times in his life. He was shipwrecked. He was gone. He went without food. He was cold. He was beaten 3 times with rods. He carried the burden of the advancement of the church. And that's just a few of the things that he faced. If you're ever having a bad day, just read 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and read Paul's life. You'll begin to realize this dude faced it. I don't know if he's ever been referred to as dude before, but anyway. These spontaneous moments, I guess. There's an interesting thing about Paul's life that sometimes speaks into it speaks into what we're talking about this morning. It's actually this idea that he had this thing called a thorn in the flesh. It's found in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. And this thorn in the flesh, there's lots of debate as to what it was. There's debate as to whether it was an eye condition or some other illness or whatever it was. But it doesn't matter what it was. He had this thing called the thorn in the flesh, and it hindered his ability to do what he believed God wanted him to do. It was almost like it was a distraction to him. He actually speaks about this in this section of 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 8. You can almost feel this coming from him. He says 3 different times, I beg the Lord to take it away. And each time he said, my grace is all you need. My power works best in weakness. This particular thing that he faced in his life, he begged God to remove it from him. If you've ever been in a situation where you're facing it, the trials are in front of you, the difficulties, the interruptions, and you look at your life and you go, God, just take it away. You know what Paul feels like. You can identify with what Paul is saying here. But it's interesting because Paul reveals something in this moment for us. He says, God said no. That should confuse us a little bit. That should create some tension inside of us. What? Just a second. I thought God was the God who's supposed to bend to my needs. I thought God was supposed to answer my prayers. I thought God was supposed to make my life comfy cozy. But God says, no, I'm not going to remove it. And he follows it up and he says that his grace and his power is what you need. What is Paul revealing to us? Paul is revealing to us something very important, that the presence of God is more important than the removal of our pain. That God's grace is what we need. See, we think we know what we need, right? We have a perspective on our lives where we think we know what we need, and we would bring it before God, which we can and which we should and which we do. But then God looks at the situation and says, no, my grace is what you need in this moment. My grace is all you need in the midst of your pain, in the midst of your sorrow. His grace is about favor. It's about acceptance. It's about kindness. It's about the work of God through the power of Jesus and the work of the Spirit on the inside. Paul realizes in this moment that the presence of God is more important. God tells him literally that my grace is all you need. Sometimes when we think we know what's best, we really don't. Because God sees our lives from a different perspective. God sees what's the internal need more than the external need. And he says, my grace, my presence is what you need in this moment. It's interesting because he also opens up an idea for us. Not only is it about God's presence with his grace, it's about the power that works best in weakness. This is the practical ability for us to be resilient. When we embrace our weakness, the door is open for the presence and the power of God to work in us. When we are weak, we're doing what? We're admitting that we can't go on, that we can't move forward. See, oftentimes we want to move forward dependent on our own strength and our own power. And when we do, we short circuit the power and the presence of God. When we think we can go forward on our own gifts and our talents and our abilities and our strength, we just pull our bootstraps up and we can make it. And yes, there's a part of that where we try to do that. But when we do, we are limiting the ability for us to experience the power of God in the moment, because he says the power works best in weakness. I 5 years ago, oh no, probably about 6 years ago, I went to India for the first time with a pastor friend of mine. And I experienced what Paul's talking about here when it refers to power being available in weakness. You need to know that as a communicator, I'm often referred to as a preacher. I was going to say something else. I'm going to leave it alone because there's not those kind of preachers that we all despise right now, but different ones preachers. Don't lump me in that category. It's interesting. When we were in India, there was this moment where I was supposed to just go to observe. I was supposed to just go watch and see what my pastor friend was doing and what the ministry was about and stuff. And next thing I know, I'm being asked to preach. Now, it's not like this. Like, there was like 3,000 people sitting on the ground for hours waiting for us to show up to teach the Bible. They were there for hours. So we're going to be here today for hours, just so you know. No, I'm just kidding. But the thing about this moment, and just kind of the piece of that speaks to the power and the weakness, is it was terrifying. I'm serious. Because the MC or the host of these large gatherings would get up to a microphone, and we didn't know who was preaching. They would just say, and now Pastor Ron is coming. I wish I could do an Indian accent for you, but I can't. And they would say my name, and I'm like, oh, boy. Okay. So we would step up, and through an interpreter, I'd have to preach. It was in these moments of weakness where I experienced the power of God. This church is a result of my own weakness, embracing the power and the grace and the presence of God as it birthed into what it is now today. Exeter, you are a result of the weakness of me as the pastor. I had to depend upon the grace and the power of God in the midst of my weakness. See, this is opening up a door for us that I think is such a critical piece to understanding how the presence of God works in the midst of our struggle, in the midst of our pain. Is that it's this opportunity for the presence of God to step in through the grace and the power. Now, Paul, he says this in the last part of verse 9. He says, so now I am glad to boast about my weakness so that the power of Christ can work through me. It's like this full transition. Please, God, take it away from me. I can't deal with this anymore. Oh, grace and power? Great. I'm going to boast about my weakness now. Like, bring it on. We don't hear that too often, do we? No. We'll boast about how strong we are and our accomplishments. We capture the highlight reel moments that we put on our social. But to boast, I mean, you need to know that Paul, this guy, the Apostle Paul, I mean, he blazed trails. Like before he became a follower of Jesus, he blazed trails as a religious leader of his day. And then he had this come to Jesus moment, which we can't get into now. But he blazed trails. There was nobody that could match his intellect. He was an incredible man. No one could debate him. He was just so incredibly smart. His zeal was just beyond anybody else's. When you read sometimes about him, he looked like he's bragging about how good he was. But in this moment, he transitions to this place that seems so upside down. He says that I am now going to boast about my weakness so that the power of God can work through me. See, we love to raise up the celebrity. We love to raise up the MVP and say, there's the life that we want. There's who we want to become. And maybe there's nothing wrong with that or bad, but isn't it incredible to think that when we look at our pain, when we look at our grief, when we look at our setbacks, our interruptions, we can actually look at them just a little bit different. Because it's in those moments where the presence of God shows up. In these moments where we have this, what Paul refers to as the thorn in the flesh, we can experience the grace and the power so we can actually settle into these moments and go, there's something greater at work. See, I asked myself this question. Why is it that Paul actually did this? And I realized it, something very important. There's a couple things that emerged from this as to why he could boast. The first one is this, that he longed to know God's presence more than he wanted the thing removed from his life. I want that to settle in for just a moment. He desired the presence of God more than he longed for the thorn in the flesh to be removed. I had to stop when that came out of the ends of my fingers on my screen, because I realized that that's not often how I approach times in my life. I sometimes flip it the other way. But Paul says, if that be the case, then I long and I desire for God's presence more than it to be gone. There's another section that he writes in Romans chapter 5, verse 3 through 5. He says, Romans chapter 5, verse 3 says, we can rejoice too when we run into problems and trials, for we know that they help us develop endurance. And endurance develops strength of character, and character strengthens our confident hope of salvation. And this hope will not lead to disappointment, for we know how dearly God loves us, because he has given us the Holy Spirit to fill our hearts with his love. See, Paul's writing this idea that if this be the case, if you're going to become a resilient follower of Jesus, if your faith is going to become resilient, there is this posture of rejoicing when the difficulties come, because they are the pathway or the doorway to more of the fullness of the character and the development of Jesus in us and through us. That the Spirit of God fills our lives up with love. And Paul says, I will rejoice, as difficult as it may be, as dark as and despair as it settles in. I am going to rejoice in this, because I know something so powerful about the Christian faith and about who God is. It's about the work of the Spirit in that moment. This is a key part for us as we begin to understand something about this idea, because it paints a picture for us to a bigger purpose to what is happening in the midst of our pain and our sorrow. See, Paul not only desired to know the presence of God more, but he also opens up a window for us to understand something very missional about our faith, and that is this, that our momentary pain opens the door for the presence of God so that we can be proclaimers of the good news of God. I want you to think about that for a second. So when we face these difficulties, when we face these struggles, there is something greater at work here than what we can see or understand. And so when we stand in that space, there's a peace that's available to us that comes from the work of God in that moment. See, Paul says this very interesting when he said in 2 Corinthians 12, he said that the power of Christ works through me. Interesting. It's not just about the grace in him, it's the grace through him. See, when our trailer was stolen just about 5 or so weeks ago, I knew that there was something that I needed to do to guide us as a community through it. And no, it wasn't a tragedy, and it really wasn't. It's just stuff, and we talked about that weeks ago. But what I began realizing in the moment, that there was something greater that was happening here, that we had to realize that God was bringing about an awareness of who he was through our interruption. And I know that when we are able to see these things through this lens, it changes everything. Because we begin to realize then that there is something happening through us, not just in us. I guess I need to ask the question then of us as we bring this to a conclusion. Do you desire to know God and his presence through the person of Jesus more than you desire for your pain to be removed? It's a question I think we all need to ask ourselves. No matter where we find ourselves in the spiritual continuum of understanding faith, we must ask ourselves this question. Do I truly long for God more? I've had to ask myself this question this week. As I've journeyed with this young family, as I learned on Tuesday morning of one of our greeters, Scott Milne. You may know who he is. He passed away on the weekend, 45 years old. I've had to ask myself, do I long to know more of God's presence than I want the pain removed? This week has been a week for many people. It's been a tough week. I'll do this very carefully, and I've asked for permission for this because the young family that lost their little one is in the room today and here in London. And they've given me the okay to do this because they've taught me something about God's presence. Just a young couple. Pretty amazing. Wednesday night we were meeting to talk about the funeral service. And the funeral was on Friday. And the mom, she said, you know, Ron, I feel like I've been let down over here by the medical world, and because the little guy was sick, and there's some issues there, but that can be paused. And then she talked about, I feel like as a mom, I didn't do enough for him. And then she said, but yet, what helps me push those two thoughts away is that I'm trusting that God's goodness is going to bring about a bigger plan in this. I've been doing this for a long time. And I got to tell you, when you see these moments with a young couple, you are pulled into that space to experience God's presence through their story. And I'm amazed at what we've been able to do as a church for them, but also what they have taught me, watching them. You know, when you look at your pain and you look at your grief and your setbacks and your interruptions, how do you look at them? Because if you're going to become resilient in your faith and in your journey of life, you've got to be able to stand on different ground. And that's what's so beautiful about the Christian faith, is that the Christian faith gives us a foundation to stand on that gives us a hope, that gives us a peace, that goes beyond our understanding, that there is a God who so loved us deeply that his son came into this world to go to a cross, to go to a tomb, to walk out of the tomb so that we might have life and have life to the full. And even though life might be filled with pain and it might be filled with sorrow and it might be filled with grief, that we can stand on different ground that allows us to rise up above these things and to know who he is in the midst of the chaos, in the midst of the confusion. There are some of us that, I don't know, do I do this? There are some of you that are robbing yourself of the presence of God because you're whining and complaining about your life. You're playing the victim. And it's time you stop playing the victim. It's just time you stop whining and complaining. Please understand my heart on this. Because you're robbing yourself of the presence of God. Allow him to give you his peace. Maybe today, maybe today, that's where you are. Maybe today is that you're just going to say, I'm done fighting against you, God. I'm done pushing back on you, God. I'm just going to open my life to you. I don't know what that actually means or what that looks like. I'm so super confused, but I'm just going to open up my life to you because I feel that you're drawing me into this peace and this new ground to stand on. And so, Jesus, today, I'm going to give you my life. Today, Jesus, I'm going to open up to you. I'm going to stop resisting you. I'm just going to accept you into my life. Maybe it's today that's you. Maybe today is the day where you embrace this love, because this love went to a cross and gave of himself fully so that we can have life and life to the full. Listen to this song.